Miss Marple and the Missing Manuscript, Chapter 1, A Recluse's Demise. The morning mist hung heavy over St. Mary Mead, weaving between the thatched cottages and draping itself across the village green like a delicate veil of gossamer. It was precisely the sort of spring morning that Miss Jane Marple particularly enjoyed, the kind that promised warmth later, but retained just enough of winter's bite to make her morning tea taste all the more comforting. She was meticulously pruning her prized roses when she first heard the news, carried on the hurried footsteps of her maid Clara, who came bustling down the garden path with uncharacteristic haste. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? It's Mr. Blackwood, the gentleman at Daisy Cottage. He's been found dead this morning." Miss Marple straightened up slowly, her weathered hands still clutching her garden shears. "Dear me," she murmured, her pale blue eyes sharp with interest. Despite her mild tone, "Natural causes, one presumes. Dr. Haydock was called, ma'am. Said it was his heart. Poor gentleman, all alone in that cottage with nobody to hear him call out if he felt poorly." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Ambrose Blackwood had moved to St. Mary Mead some 3 years prior, causing the usual flutter of interest that any newcomer inevitably generated in such a small village. He was a tall, distinguished gentleman of perhaps 65, with iron-grey hair and a rather intimidating pair of bushy eyebrows. He rarely participated in village affairs, politely declining invitations to tea and church fetes alike. The general consensus, as Miss Marple had gleaned from the village gossip, was that he was writing something important and valued his privacy. By mid-afternoon, the persistent drizzle that had replaced the morning mist found Miss Marple making her way carefully along the high street under a black umbrella. If anyone had inquired about her destination, she would have mentioned a need to select new knitting wool from the haberdashery. The fact that her route took her past Daisy Cottage was, of course, merely coincidental. A police car was parked outside the small stone dwelling, its presence as incongruous in the sleepy village as a peacock in a henhouse. Miss Marple recognized Inspector Craddock immediately, as he emerged from the cottage, turning up his collar against the rain. "Miss Marple," he said, genuine pleasure warming his voice. "I might have known you'd appear." "I was merely passing," she replied with gentle dignity, "though I confess I had heard about poor Mr. Blackwood. Such a shock." Inspector Craddock glanced back at the cottage, his expression troubled. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I'm not entirely satisfied that it was natural causes. We received an anonymous telephone call suggesting there might be irregularities." "Indeed." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes sharpened with interest. "Perhaps you wouldn't mind stepping inside for a moment. You knew the deceased, I understand." "Hardly knew him at all," Miss Marple corrected, "though one cannot help but observe one's neighbours, of course." The interior of Daisy Cottage was meticulously neat, with the exception of the study where, it seemed, Mr. Blackwood had been found. A wing-backed chair was positioned by the fireplace, and on the small table beside it sat a half-empty teacup. Miss Marple approached it carefully, noting the strange residue that clung to the porcelain. The desk by the window was covered with disarranged papers, and the blotter was stained with what appeared to be spilled ink. Most curiously, a fountain pen lay on the floor, still clutched in the stiffened hand of the deceased. "He wasn't just any writer," Craddock explained quietly. "Blackwood was once quite a famous journalist. Retreated from public life after some scandal about fabricated stories, and I've reason to believe he was working on his memoirs, apparently containing some rather explosive revelations about certain prominent families." "Including some in St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Inspector Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You suspect something? One hears things living in a village." "Mr. Blackwood was seen in conversation with Colonel Bantry last week. Most unusual, as the Colonel generally avoided him. Their conversation was interrupted by an agitated knock at the front door. A constable admitted Mrs. Bantry, the Colonel's wife, her tweeds damp from the rain, and her usually composed face flushed with distress. "Inspector," I've only just heard. Is it true about Mr. Blackwood? Arthur, my husband, will be most distressed. The man interviewed him only last week about what he called wartime indiscretions. He implied he had documentation that could ruin several reputations. Inspector, I fear Arthur hasn't slept properly since. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Craddock, whose face had grown grave. Did your husband mention what sort of documentation, Mrs. Bantry? Some manuscript he was preparing? Arthur wouldn't speak of it, but I haven't seen him so troubled since the war. After a thorough but fruitless search of the cottage, no manuscript of any kind was discovered among Blackwood's possessions. As twilight approached, bringing with it a penetrating chill, Miss Marple made her way home through the gathering darkness. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a glistening wetness that reflected the first glimmerings of stars overhead. She was contemplating the curious position of the fountain pen in Blackwood's hand when she reached her garden gate. It stood ajar, strange as she was certain she had latched it that morning. With a sudden alertness that belied her advanced years, she noticed muddy footprints leading to her back door. Her cottage was exactly as she had left it, or so it appeared at first glance, but Miss Marple's observant eyes soon detected subtle signs of disturbance. A cushion not quite in its proper place, books on her shelves marginally rearranged. Someone had searched her home with considerable care. As she bent to pick up her knitting basket, her gaze fell upon a small object on the doormat, gleaming dully in the lamplight. It was a silver fountain pen cap, identical to the one missing from Ambrose Blackwood's pen. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Visitor. The morning brought with it a brilliant clarity that only follows a night of rain. Dew sparkled on the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, the silver fountain pen cap safely tucked into her handbag. She had spent a restless night, contemplating the implications of her discovery, her mind working methodically through the possibilities like a loom weaving together disparate threads. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, greeted her with characteristic warmth. Jane, how fortunate! We have a visitor who's been most eager to make your acquaintance. The drawing-room of the vicarage held the comforting scent of beeswax and lavender. Seated near the window, bathed in a gentle shaft of morning sunlight, was a woman of striking appearance. She rose gracefully as Miss Marple entered, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Lady Catherine Haymarket, she introduced herself, her voice possessing the cultured tones of aristocratic breeding. I've heard so much about you, Miss Marple. The vicar speaks most highly of your discernment. Lady Catherine was perhaps 45, with elegantly coiffed dark hair, showing the first dignified streaks of silver at the temples. Her attire was impeccable, a tailored suit of fine wool in a shade of deep burgundy that spoke of wealth without ostentation. Miss Marple noted the exceptional quality of her pearl earrings and the substantial diamond on her left hand. Lady Catherine has purchased Gossington Hall, Mrs. Clement explained, pouring tea from a silver pot that had seen better days. Such a blessing to have the old place occupied again, isn't it? Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, accepting a cup. Though I imagine it requires considerable attention after standing empty for so long. A labor of love, Lady Catherine replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I understand there was some excitement in the village yesterday. A death, was it not? There was something in her casual tone that caused Miss Marple to look up sharply. Lady Catherine's hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, belying her composed expression. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marple confirmed, a rather private gentleman who lived at Daisy Cottage. Blackwood? Lady Catherine's cup froze halfway to her lips. Ambrose Blackwood, how extraordinary. I knew him in London, in another life, as it were. Indeed? Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing. He was quite the literary figure once, Lady Catherine continued, setting down her cup with deliberate care. Before his disgrace, was there anything unusual about his death? One hears such stories about village life. The police are making inquiries, Miss Marple answered carefully. There is some concern about certain papers of his. A manuscript, I believe, that appears to be missing. The tremor in Lady Catherine's hands became more pronounced. A manuscript? How fascinating. What was the subject matter, do you know? I couldn't say, Miss Marple replied, though there are suggestions it contained revelations about certain prominent families. Lady Catherine stood abruptly. How dreadful. One does hope it isn't some scandalous exposé. Such things rarely serve any purpose, except to cause pain. She glanced at her watch. I'm afraid I must take my leave. The decorators are arriving at Gossington this morning. After Lady Catherine's departure, Mrs. Clement sighed appreciatively. Such distinction. And so generous. She's already promised a substantial donation for the church roof fund. Has she been in the village long? Miss Marple inquired. Just these past 2 weeks, she mentioned, knowing the previous owners of Gossington distantly through family connections. Jane, Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. There is something I perhaps should mention. Mr. Blackwood had been visiting the church archives several times in recent months. The vicar thought it strange, his interest in old parish records from the 1930s. He was most insistent on examining them alone. Miss Marple's interest was immediately piqued. Perhaps I might take a look at these records myself. For the Historical Society, you understand. In the musty quiet of the church archive room, Miss Marple carefully examined the leather-bound volumes of parish records. Almost immediately, she noted several pages had been meticulously removed from the Registry of Births and Marriages from 1935. The cuts were clean and precise, made with a sharp blade. She was still contemplating this discovery when Inspector Craddock found her, his expression grave. Ah, Miss Marple, I've been looking for you. The toxicology reports have come back regarding Mr. Blackwood. He glanced around to ensure they were alone. There was poison in his teacup digitalis, derived from foxgloves, in the right dose. It would appear similar to a heart attack in an older gentleman. Foxgloves, Miss Marple murmured. They grow in abundance in several gardens in St. Mary Mead, including your own, Miss Marple, the inspector noted with a small smile. Though I dare say half the village could be suspects on that basis. Miss Marple was about to reply when they were interrupted by hurried footsteps. A young man with untidy brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles peered anxiously into the archive room. Excuse me? Oh, Inspector Craddock. I was told I might find you here. The young man twisted his cap nervously in his hands. David Parsons, the inspector explained to Miss Marple. Mr. Blackwood's part-time secretary. What can I do for you, Mr. Parsons? I felt I should come forward, sir, about Mr. Blackwood. The young man glanced anxiously between them. Might we speak somewhere private? Later that afternoon, David Parsons sat in Miss Marple's garden, a cup of tea cooling untouched beside him. At Miss Marple's gentle urging, he had agreed to share his concerns with her as well as with the inspector. Mr. Blackwood gave me a sealed envelope about a week ago, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. For safekeeping, he said. He was terribly vague about what it contained, but impressed upon me the importance of keeping it secure. The young man swallowed hard. When I heard about his death, I checked the hiding place, a hollow book in my cottage, but the envelope had been replaced with blank papers. Somebody knew, you see, and I fear they're watching me now. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Did Mr. Blackwood give any indication of what the envelope might contain? He mentioned it was insurance, David replied. Said, if anything happened to him, I was to take it directly to a solicitor in London, but he never gave me the solicitor's name. And now, his voice trailed off miserably as David took his leave through the garden gate. Miss Marple noticed a sleek black automobile moving slowly along the lane. Through the half-open window, she caught a glimpse of the driver, Lady Catherine Haymarket, who, upon realizing she had been observed, accelerated away with unnecessary haste. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly as Miss Marple attended to her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically as her mind worked through the puzzle of Ambrose Blackwood and his missing manuscript. As dusk fell, bringing with it a chill that penetrated the old cottage, there came a knock at her door. A village boy stood on her doorstep, cap in hand. "Note for you, Miss Marple," he said, handing her a folded piece of paper before darting away into the gathering darkness. Miss Marple opened it beneath the warm glow of her hallway lamp. The message was brief, written in gleaming silver ink that caught the light as she tilted the paper. "The manuscript still exists. Meet me at Gossington Boathouse at 9 p.m. There was no signature, but the handwriting was elegant and confident, penned with what could only be a distinctive silver-inked fountain pen. Chapter 3. Secrets of Gossington Hall. The evening air hung heavy with moisture as Miss Marple made her way along the winding path that led to Gossington Hall's grounds. An owl hooted mournfully from somewhere within the ancient oaks that lined the estate, and the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush provided an unsettling accompaniment to her cautious footsteps. She had deliberated carefully before deciding to accept the anonymous summons. It was most certainly imprudent, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that the pursuit of truth occasionally necessitated risks. She had, however, taken the precaution of informing her faithful maid of her destination, with instructions to alert Inspector Craddock should she not return by 11. The boathouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the moonlit surface of the small lake. Its weathered timber frame spoke of decades of neglect, the once elegant structure now presenting a rather forlorn aspect. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, listening intently. The gentle lapping of water against the little dock was the only sound that greeted her. Drawing her cardigan more tightly around her slender shoulders, she stepped inside. The interior was cloaked in shadow, illuminated only by slivers of moonlight that penetrated through gaps in the wooden slats. It appeared empty. "Hello," she called softly, her voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "Is anyone there?" A sudden movement from the far corner caused her to start. A figure emerged from the shadows, not the mysterious note-writer she had anticipated, but David Parsons, looking as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Miss Marple, what on earth are you doing here?" he exclaimed, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "I might ask you the same question, Mr. Parsons," she replied mildly. "Did you receive a note as well?" He nodded, producing a folded paper from his pocket, asking me to come to the boathouse at 9. I thought perhaps it was someone with information about Mr. Blackwood's envelope. Their bewildered exchange was interrupted by a sharp splash from outside, followed by a strangled cry that seemed to be cut abruptly short. Without hesitation, they hurried back onto the wooden dock that extended into the lake. The moonlight revealed a disturbance in the water, and to their horror, a human form floating face down near the edge. "Good heavens," gasped Miss Marple. "Quickly, Mr. Parsons." Between them, they managed to pull the waterlogged body onto the dock. It was a man, middle-aged, dressed in a dark suit, now sodden and clinging to his frame. Despite their efforts to revive him, it was evident they were too late. The man's skull bore evidence of a severe blow to the back of the head, the hair matted with blood that appeared black in the moonlight. "Do you know him?" Miss Marple asked quietly. David Parsons nodded, his face pale in the silvery light. "It's Martin Wells, Lady Catherine's personal secretary. I met him yesterday when I delivered some books to Gossington Hall. Within the hour, Gossington's elegant drawing room had been transformed into an impromptu incident room. Inspector Craddock directed his men with grim efficiency, while Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, observing. Lady Catherine, still immaculately dressed despite the late hour, displayed an admirable composure as she answered the inspector's questions. "Wells has been in my employ for just over 3 years, she explained, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He was an invaluable assistant, particularly in matters relating to my literary interests." "Literary interests?" Lady Catherine Craddock inquired. I am a patron of several publishing ventures, she replied smoothly. Martin often acted as my representative in such matters. And what brought Mr. Wells to the boathouse this evening? A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed Lady Catherine's aristocratic features. I couldn't say. He mentioned nothing to me about going out this evening. The investigation revealed that Martin Wells had previously worked for Anderson and Blake, a prestigious London publishing house, the same firm that had reportedly offered Ambrose Blackwood a substantial sum for his memoirs. More significantly, a thorough search of Wells' clothing yielded a torn page of manuscript, partially waterlogged but still legible. It contained tantalizing references to a wartime betrayal and something called the Gossington Affair, events dating back to World War II. Colonel Bantry, summoned from his bed and looking decidedly uncomfortable in the drawing-room of his former home, reluctantly confirmed that during the war, Gossington Hall had indeed served as a military headquarters. There was an incident, he admitted finally after much circumlocution. Sensitive documents disappeared. Their loss resulted in a failed operation and casualties. His weathered face seemed to age further as he spoke. The matter was hushed up, naturally, to prevent scandal, but several officers fell under suspicion, including myself. And Blackwood, Inspector Craddock prompted. What was his connection? He was a junior reporter then. Colonel Bantry replied. Somehow, he got wind of the incident, asked questions. Most persistent fellow. The following morning found Miss Marple at the village library, where Mrs. Bantry served as a trustee. The Colonel's wife appeared strained, the usual energetic brightness of her manner somewhat diminished. You're interested in photographs from the war years, she asked, leading Miss Marple to a glass-fronted cabinet containing several leather-bound albums. I donated these to the library myself. Didn't want them about the house after we sold Gossington. Too many memories, you understand. The albums contain numerous black and white photographs documenting the period when Gossington Hall served as a military headquarters. Miss Marple examined them methodically, her observant eyes missing nothing. In one group photograph taken on the front steps of Gossington, she noticed a young officer standing slightly apart from the main group. There was something familiar about his features, despite the difference that decades would make. Beneath the photograph, a caption listed the names of those pictured. The young man was identified not as Ambrose Blackwood, but as Lieutenant James Franklin. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple took advantage of the pleasant weather to tend to her garden. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the churchyard across the lane. Her attention was drawn to two figures engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion among the gravestones, Lady Catherine and Colonel Bantry. Their conversation, though inaudible at this distance, was clearly intense, with emphatic gestures from the Colonel and a rigid posture from Lady Catherine that suggested barely contained emotion. When darkness fell, Miss Marple retired to her cottage, mentally reviewing the day's discoveries. She secured the door carefully before making her evening cocoa, but upon entering her kitchen, she stopped short. On her table sat a typewritten page that had certainly not been there when she left. With steady hands that belied her inner disquiet, she picked up the paper and read, "The final chapter will shock St. Mary Mead to its core. You're getting too close, old woman." The note was signed not with a name, but with a small ink drawing of a fox. Chapter 4. The publisher's interest. A light but persistent rain pattered against the windows of Miss Marple's cottage the following morning, casting the drawing-room in a gloomy half-light that matched her pensive mood. She had just secured the threatening note in her escritoire when a firm knock sounded at her front door. Inspector Craddock stood on her doorstep, water dripping from the brim of his hat. His normally composed features bore the unmistakable signs of a man who had spent the night in pursuit of answers rather than sleep. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, accepting her invitation to step inside. "I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all, Inspector. I was just about to prepare some tea." You look as though you could use some. As the tea steeped, Inspector Craddock shared his latest findings. We've been examining Wells' recent telephone records. It seems he made a call to his employer at Anderson and Blake Publishers the day before his death. According to the switchboard operator, he was quite agitated, claiming to have located the manuscript everyone is after. Most interesting, wouldn't you say? Indeed, murmured Miss Marple, pouring the tea with a steady hand. And has this publishing house been approached regarding the matter? Better than that, Craddock replied with a grim smile. The director himself, Edward Blake, arrived in St. Mary Mead this morning. Says he wants to assist with our inquiries. I thought you might like to be present when I speak with him. Your perspective has proven valuable in the past. An hour later, they were seated in the private parlor of the Blue Boar, the village's modest hotel where Edward Blake had taken accommodation. Blake proved to be a man of perhaps 50, with a cultivated appearance that spoke of Savile Row tailoring and the kind of assured sophistication that comes from moving in elevated circles. His silver hair was immaculately styled, and his manner combined affability with an underlying sharpness that reminded Miss Marple rather of a well-groomed fox. Of course I want to cooperate fully, Blake assured them, gesturing expansively. Martin Wells was a valued employee before Lady Catherine poached him for a private service. His death is a profound shock. I understand your firm had a publishing agreement with Ambrose Blackwood, Inspector Craddock stated. Blake nodded, his expression becoming serious. An exclusive contract for his memoirs. Yes, potentially explosive material. Blackwood had spent years gathering evidence about several prominent families involved in wartime espionage and black market activities. An expensive undertaking, I imagine, Miss Marple observed quietly. Oh, indeed. Blake's eyes flickered briefly to her before returning to the inspector. We had agreed on an advance of £50,000. A considerable sum, but the revelations would have been worth every penny. Blackwood had a particular gift for uncovering secrets people preferred to keep buried. After further questioning revealed little of immediate relevance, Miss Marple extended an invitation to Blake to take tea at her cottage that afternoon. Perhaps a more informal conversation might yield additional recollections, she suggested, and I should be delighted to show you my garden. I understand you have an interest in horticulture. Blake accepted with evident pleasure. True to his word, he admired Miss Marple's garden with the knowledgeable eye of an enthusiast, displaying particular interest in her roses. She noted with inward alertness her foxgloves, which grew alongside as natural pest control. These digitalis are magnificent specimens, he remarked, bending to examine the plants more closely. So beautiful, yet so deadly in the wrong hands. Over tea and seed cake, Miss Marple gently guided the conversation to Blackwood's research methods. It must require particular skills to uncover secrets buried for decades, she commented. Blackwood was methodical, Blake replied. Military training, I suspect. He cultivated sources over years, built trust, collected documentation piece by piece. He assembled his case. He sipped his tea appreciatively. I understand you've made Lady Catherine's acquaintance. Yes, at the vicarage, Miss Marple confirmed. She mentioned knowing Mr. Blackwood from London. A subtle smile played across Blake's features. She would, yes. Catherine moves in literary circles, always has done since her debut in society. Remarkable woman. The afternoon clouded over as Blake took his leave, promising to remain in the village for a few days in case the police required further assistance. Miss Marple watched him depart with a thoughtful expression, mentally reviewing their conversation for significant details. Her planned meeting with David Parsons later that day caused her increasing concern when the young man failed to appear at the appointed time. After waiting a prudent interval, she made her way to his cottage on the outskirts of the village. The modest dwelling appeared undisturbed from the outside, but Miss Marple's gentle knock received no answer. After a moment's hesitation, she tried the handle. To her surprise, the door opened. The interior was meticulously clean. Unnaturally so, she thought, noting the distinctive and rather overwhelming scent of bleach that lingered in the air. "Lazarus Sir Parsons," she called, receiving only silence in response. The sitting room showed no signs of disturbance, but also no signs of habitation, no cup left on a table, no book laid aside, no impression on the cushions of the armchair. It was as though the room had been scrubbed of all human presence. In the small study adjacent to the sitting room, a writing desk stood beneath the window. Upon it lay a fountain pen, identical in design to Ambrose Blackwood's but intact, with its silver cap in place. Miss Marple had just picked it up for closer examination when she heard the cottage door open behind her. She turned, the pen still in her hand, to find Colonel Bantry regarding her with evident surprise from the study doorway. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find you here, nor I you, Colonel," she replied calmly, though her heart had accelerated at the unexpected encounter. "I had arranged to meet Mr. Parsons, but he appears to be absent." "Yes, most odd," the Colonel agreed, his weathered face furrowed with concern. "I came to return a book he was kind enough to lend me. Military history. The young man has a commendable interest in the subject." Miss Marple held up a fountain pen. "I noticed this on the desk. Quite a distinctive item." Colonel Bantry's face paled visibly. "May I?" he asked, extending his hand. Miss Marple placed the pen in his palm, observing his reaction carefully. He turned it over, examining the subtle engraving near the clip. "Just as I thought," he murmured. "This is a service pen, Miss Marple, given to intelligence officers during the war. They contained a special silver-based ink, useful for certain specialized communications. Where would Parsons get such a thing?" "Perhaps from Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple suggested. "If, as we now suspect, he was not merely a journalist during the war years." They left the cottage together, both troubled by the implications of their discovery. As they reached the lane, Miss Marple glimpsed a figure across the way, partially concealed by the hedgerow of the neighboring property. It was Edward Blake, engaged in intense conversation on the public telephone outside the village shop. His gaze was fixed on the cottage they had just exited, and he turned abruptly away when he noticed Miss Marple's observation. The evening descended into a damp, chilly darkness that seemed to press against the windows of Miss Marple's cottage as she sat knitting beside the fire, her thoughts circling the puzzle of Ambrose Blackwood and his missing manuscript. The telephone's sharp ring cut through the silence, causing her to start slightly. It was Inspector Craddock, his voice grave. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know immediately. David Parsons has been found dead in Cuckoo Woods. It appears to be suicide. A note was discovered confessing to Blackwood's murder." "A typewritten note, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked sharply. "Yes. How did you—" "I wonder," she interrupted gently, "if you would be so kind as to compare it with a note I received yesterday evening. I believe you may find they were produced on the same machine." After the inspector had departed with her threatening note secured in an evidence envelope, Miss Marple sat for a long time gazing into the dying embers of her fire. The supposed suicide of David Parsons might satisfy the official requirements for closure in Blackwood's death, but it did nothing to explain the missing manuscript, the connection to Gossington Hall's wartime secrets, or the murder of Martin Wells. Someone in St. Mary Mead was playing a dangerous game indeed, and Miss Marple was beginning to form a very clear idea of who that someone might be. Chapter 5. The Gossington Affair. The morning brought a fine drizzle that veiled St. Mary Mead in a pearly mist, softening the outlines of cottages and gardens as Miss Marple made her way to the village post office. She had spent a restless night contemplating the convenient suicide of young David Parsons, and dawn had found her with a plan of action forming in her mind like knitting stitches, each one connecting to the next in an intricate pattern. Dorothy, the postmistress's daughter, was arranging stamps behind the counter when Miss Marple entered, the small bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle at odds with the somber atmosphere that had descended over the village following the discovery of yet another body. Good morning, Dorothy. Miss Marple greeted her pleasantly. I wonder if I might trouble you for some information. Strictly for the Historical Society records, you understand. Dorothy, a sensible young woman of 25 with a fondness for Miss Marple that dated back to childhood Sunday school lessons, smiled warmly. Of course, Miss Marple. What can I help you with? I was curious about Mr. Blackwood's correspondence, Miss Marple said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. Did he receive regular post from London by any chance? Dorothy's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced about the empty shop before leaning across the counter. Well, I shouldn't really say, but... She hesitated, then continued in an undertone. He did receive letters quite regularly from a London address, always the same envelope, quite distinctive, cream-colored with a particular watermark. Do you recall the address by any chance? The young woman nodded. 21 Bedford Square, the same as those publishing people who've been asking about him since his death. But, she frowned slightly, the letters weren't addressed to Blackwood, exactly. They came for someone called Franklin. Indeed. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. How very curious. Thank you, Dorothy. You've been most helpful. Her next call was at Gossington Hall, where she found Lady Catherine in the midst of packing. Elegant travelling cases open on the bed of the master suite. Lady Catherine's surprise at Miss Marple's unannounced visit was evident, but she maintained her composure with the practised ease of one accustomed to social demands. Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. I'm afraid you find me in disarray. I've been called back to London on urgent business. How unfortunate, Miss Marple replied mildly, taking in the hastily packed cases and Lady Catherine's slightly dishevelled appearance, so at odds with her usual immaculate presentation. I had hoped we might have a chance to speak further about Mr. Blackwood, or perhaps I should say, Lieutenant Franklin. The effect was immediate and startling. Lady Catherine's aristocratic composure crumbled, the colour draining from her face as she sank onto the edge of the bed. How did you... No, I suppose it doesn't matter now. She gestured wearily to a chair. Please sit down, Miss Marple. It seems we have much to discuss. Your real name is Catherine Franklin, Miss Marple stated gently. It was not a question. Lady Catherine nodded, her gaze fixed on her tightly clasped hands. Yes, I was Ambrose's wife. We married in 1938, when he was still James Franklin, an intelligence officer assigned to investigate security breaches. After the scandal, when he disappeared and reinvented himself as Blackwood the journalist, I remained Catherine Franklin. We never divorced, and you came to St. Mary Mead, to see him again, Lady Catherine replied, a hint of defiance entering her voice, to try to understand why he'd returned to a place connected with so much pain, and to convince him not to publish certain chapters of his memoir. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Chapters that implicated my father, a high-ranking military officer, in the Gossington affair. But you didn't kill him, Miss Marple supplied. No, I arrived the day after his death. I'd written to him of my intention to purchase Gossington, a symbol, I thought, of confronting the past, but we hadn't yet met in person. After all these years, her voice broke slightly. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. I believe you, Lady Catherine, but I fear someone has gone to great lengths to create a narrative in which you might appear culpable. While Lady Catherine composed herself, Miss Marple took her leave, her mind already turning to her next inquiry. She found Inspector Craddock at the police station, where he greeted her with evident relief. Miss Marple, I was about to telephone you. We've made a rather significant discovery concerning Martin Wells. He led her to his office, where he spread several bank statements across his desk. Wells had been withdrawing large sums of money, far more than his salary, as Lady Catherine's secretary would allow. We're trying to trace where it came from and where it went. I suspect it may have come from Edward Blake, Miss Marple suggested. And as for where it went, perhaps to David Parsons, in exchange for information about Blackwood's manuscript. The inspector studied her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You've formed a theory, I see." "Several, in fact," she admitted, "but I need to confirm certain details. Inspector, I wonder if you might inquire whether any of the village's older residents might have recognized Mr. Blackwood from the war years. Sometimes the elderly have excellent memories for faces, even after decades." This line of inquiry led them to Mrs. Blackett, a sprightly octogenarian who had served as housekeeper at Gossington Hall during the war. When shown the photograph Miss Marple had discovered in the library album, Mrs. Blackett adjusted her spectacles and nodded decisively. "Oh yes, that's Lieutenant Franklin. That is, a very serious young man, always writing in that little notebook of his. He was investigating the missing documents case, wasn't he? Terrible business. They suspected sabotage, you know, not the reporter covering the story." "Inspector Craddock," clarified. Mrs. Blackett shook her head emphatically. "Oh no, he was part of the intelligence team sent from London. Very hush-hush. There was that other fellow too, the clerk, always hanging about, listening where he shouldn't. What was his name now? Blake? That was it. Edward Blake. Caused quite a stir when he and that other young man were found together in circumstances that weren't considered appropriate in those days. The pieces were beginning to form a coherent picture. Lieutenant James Franklin, investigating the stolen documents case, had met and married Catherine. After the scandal, whatever its precise nature, he had disappeared, reinventing himself as journalist Ambrose Blackwood. Years later, he returned to write his memoirs, which would have revealed the true culprit of the document theft. As twilight descended once more upon St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned home to find a small package had been delivered to her letterbox. Inside was a single chapter of manuscript with a handwritten note, "In case something happens to me, Blackwood." With trembling fingers, she unfolded the pages and began to read. The chapter detailed, in precise and damning prose, how military secrets from Gossington Hall had been systematically sold to enemy agents by someone within the headquarters, an individual code-named the Fox. Miss Marple was so absorbed in her reading that the knock at her door came as a startling interruption. Setting the manuscript pages carefully beneath a cushion, she went to answer it. Edward Blake stood on her doorstep, his urbane smile failing to reach his cold eyes. Behind him, partially concealed in the deepening shadows of her garden path, stood Colonel Bantry, an odd tight expression on his face, and what appeared to be a gardening trowel clutched in his right hand. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Blake said with chilling politeness. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Chapter 6. The final chapter. "Won't you please come in, gentlemen?" Miss Marple said with remarkable composure, stepping aside to allow her unexpected visitors to enter. "I was just about to prepare some tea." She led them into her sitting room, the very picture of an elderly lady entertaining evening callers, betraying not the slightest hint that she had just been reading damning evidence or that she recognized the potential threat these men posed. The manuscript pages remained safely hidden beneath the cushion as she busied herself with the familiar ritual of preparing tea, her mind working with the precision that had unraveled so many mysteries in the past. "I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you believe I have that belongs to you, Mr. Blake," she said, placing the teapot on the table with steady hands. Her knitting basket sat nearby, the long needles protruding at an angle that made them readily accessible should the need arise. Blake's urbane veneer had thinned, revealing an edge of impatience beneath. "Let's not play games, Miss Marple. Blackwood's manuscript, or at least the portion of it that was in David Parsons' possession. I know he delivered it to you." Colonel Bantry remained near the doorway, his expression unreadable, the gardening trowel still clutched awkwardly in his hand. Miss Marple noticed a smudge of fresh earth on its blade. "How very interesting," she remarked, her tone conversational as she poured the tea. "You seem remarkably well informed about Mr. Parsons' movements before his unfortunate death." "I make it my business to know things, Miss Marple. Information is currency in my profession, Blake replied, his eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. Indeed, rather like during the war, I imagine, when certain information from Gossington Hall proved quite valuable as currency on the international market. Miss Marple handed him a cup of tea with a steady hand. The fox wasn't a single person, was it? It was a partnership. The subtle shift in Blake's expression told her she had struck home. Colonel Bantry's face, however, remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the carpet as though studying the pattern with intense concentration. Mr. Blackwood, or Lieutenant Franklin, as he was then, discovered this partnership, but couldn't prove it conclusively before the case was closed. Miss Marple continued, taking her seat and folding her hands in her lap. That's why he spent years gathering evidence for his book, not for sensationalism or financial gain, but to right a wrong that had haunted him for decades. Pure conjecture, Blake said dismissively, though his knuckles whitened around the delicate teacup. Blackwood was a discredited journalist searching for a path back to respectability. Oh, I don't think so, Miss Marple replied gently. You see, several pieces of evidence point quite clearly in a specific direction. The distinctive fountain pen, for instance, an intelligence service issue, as Colonel Bantry confirmed, and the choice of foxglove poison as the murder weapon, a rather pointed reference to the fox, wouldn't you say? But most significantly, she turned her gaze directly to Blake. There's the wartime photograph showing you as a young clerk at Gossington, though you claimed never to have visited before. Blake set down his cup with a sharp clink. Fascinating theories, Miss Marple, but utterly without foundation. Now, the manuscript, if you please. You were lovers, Miss Marple said simply, addressing both men now. During the war, when such relationships had to be hidden at all costs, the intelligence leak was your way of securing funds for a future together. But something went wrong. The silence that followed seemed to crystallize the air in the room. Then, with a suddenness that belied his age, Blake lunged toward Miss Marple. His movement was arrested by a sharp command from the doorway to the kitchen. That's quite enough, Mr. Blake. Inspector Craddock stepped into the room, followed by Sergeant Hay. They had been concealed in Miss Marple's kitchen throughout the conversation, having arrived discreetly through the back entrance following her telephone call earlier that evening. Edward Blake, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murders of Ambrose Blackwood, Martin Wells, and David Parsons, the inspector stated formally. Colonel Bantry, however, appeared genuinely shocked, his weathered face crumpling in disbelief. Edward, it was you and Wells? All these years, I thought. He broke off, staring at the trowel in his hand as though seeing it for the first time. Miss Marple regarded him with gentle understanding. You came here tonight thinking I had discovered something that implicated you in the old scandal, didn't you, Colonel? The trowel was for my garden, an excuse for your visit, not a weapon. You've been protecting your reputation all these years, believing yourself under suspicion, when in fact you were merely another victim of misdirection. The colonel sank heavily into a chair, the trowel clattering to the floor. I was investigated, you know, my career nearly ruined. There were whispers, innuendos. I never knew who was responsible for the document theft, but the shadow of suspicion never quite lifted. Blake's composure had shattered entirely. His confession emerged in bitter staccato phrases, each one more damning than the last. He and Martin Wells had indeed been the real spies, using Bantry's security clearance to access documents that were then passed to enemy agents through a network of intermediaries. When Blackwood returned to St. Mary Mead and began researching, Wells recognized him from the war. Blake spat, all pretense abandoned. We kept tabs on him through the publishing deal, watching as he pieced together the truth. Then we learned he was close to finishing the manuscript and planned to name names. We had no choice. So you poisoned his tea with digitalis from Miss Marple's foxgloves, Inspector Craddock supplied. Rather poetic, using the fox's signature in such a manner. Wells retrieved most of the manuscript, Blake continued, a strange pride entering his voice. But the fool grew greedy, decided he wanted more money for his silence. He was planning to blackmail me with the pages he'd kept back. And David Parsons, Miss Marple asked quietly. A convenient scapegoat. We learned he'd hidden part of the manuscript on Blackwood's instructions. Once we had what we needed, Wells arranged to meet him at the boathouse. The plan was to frame Lady Catherine. Blackwood's estranged wife returning to silence him made a tidy narrative. But the boy saw something he shouldn't have when Wells killed her secretary. As Blake was led away, handcuffed and diminished, Colonel Bantry remained in Miss Marple's sitting room, visibly struggling to reconcile decades of suspicion and fear with the truth finally revealed. I never imagined, Blake and Wells. They were always so correct. And all those years while I wondered who had betrayed us, who had cost those young men their lives in that failed operation, his voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of misplaced guilt. Miss Marple poured him a fresh cup of tea, adding a small measure of brandy from the decanter she kept for medicinal purposes. People are rarely what they seem, Colonel. Those who maintain the most impeccable facades often have the most to hide. The following morning dawned with the pristine clarity that sometimes follows a thunderstorm. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with the news of Edward Blake's arrest and the shocking revelations about the wartime espionage that had cast such long shadows across the decades. Inspector Craddock, looking remarkably refreshed despite the late night, called at Miss Marple's cottage to share the latest developments. "We found the remainder of Blackwood's manuscript," he announced triumphantly. "The most extraordinary hiding place. You'll appreciate this, Miss Marple. It was concealed in plain sight, baked into the binding of vintage books he had donated to the village library. Each volume contained a chapter, right under everyone's noses." "How very clever," Miss Marple nodded appreciatively. "The one place no one would think to look, yet accessible to anyone who knew the secret." "There's more," Craddock continued. "We've confirmed through fingerprint analysis that Blackwood was indeed Lieutenant James Franklin. After the war, he pursued a career in journalism under his new identity, apparently using his investigative skills to continue gathering evidence about the Gossington affair. The manuscript is a masterpiece of methodical research. Names, dates, bank transactions. Blake and Wells won't escape conviction." "And Lady Catherine?" Miss Marple inquired. "Cleared of all suspicion," the inspector confirmed. "She's decided to remain in St. Mary Mead as it happens. She's inherited Blackwood's cottage. They were still legally married, despite their long separation." Later that week, Miss Marple received a visitor. As she tended to her garden in the gentle afternoon sunshine, Lady Catherine, dressed now in simple attire that somehow suited her more naturally than her previous formality, made her way along the garden path. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her aristocratic reserve softened by genuine emotion. "The inspector has explained how instrumental you were in uncovering the truth." "Not at all," Miss Marple demurred, setting aside her trowel. "Truth has a way of emerging, even after decades of concealment, rather like bulbs that have lain dormant through the winter, only to bloom in spring." They took tea beneath the apple tree, its branches heavy with nascent fruit. Lady Catherine spoke of her plans to restore Blackwood's cottage and perhaps to write a memoir of her own. "Not sensationalist," she hastened to add, "but I think James Ambrose would have wanted his real story told. Once the truth about the Gossington affair was revealed, he never stopped loving you," Miss Marple said gently, reaching into her knitting bag to retrieve a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "This was among his effects, Inspector Craddock tells me. It was meant for you, his final chapter, as it were." Lady Catherine unwrapped the silver fountain pen with trembling fingers, her eyes filling with tears as she recognized it. "He kept it all these years," she whispered. "Our government service pens were meant to be turned in after the war. This was his way of holding on to that part of his life, of us." "How did you know it was Blake?" she asked after composing herself. There were so many possibilities, so many suspects. "Foxgloves," Miss Marple replied, glancing at the stately purple flowers nodding in the afternoon breeze at the edge of her garden. "They're beautiful but deadly if misused. rather like secrets, and Mr. Blake admired them a little too knowledgeably when he visited my garden. But more importantly, she smiled, her faded blue eyes twinkling with the wisdom of long experience. In all my years observing human nature, I've found that vanity is often the downfall of clever people. The fox drawing as a signature on that threatening note was just a bit too pleased with itself, the work of someone who couldn't resist claiming credit for his cleverness, even while trying to deflect suspicion. She gazed thoughtfully across her garden to where the church spire rose above the ancient yew trees. Some secrets ache to be revealed, Lady Catherine, even by those most determined to keep them. It's the nature of truth to find its way into the light, however long the journey may take. As the summer deepened, St. Mary Mead gradually returned to its peaceful rhythms. The scandal of the Gossington affair, after briefly setting tongues wagging throughout the county, settled into the village's collective memory as yet another chapter in its long history. Miss Marple returned to her knitting in her garden, observing with quiet satisfaction as Lady Catherine found a place within the community, her initial aura of aristocratic remove softening into genuine belonging. The full manuscript of Ambrose Blackwood, or Lieutenant James Franklin, as he was now known to have been, was eventually published, although with certain sensitive sections redacted at the request of the government. Its revelations caused a minor sensation in military circles, but brought a measure of justice to those who had been wrongfully implicated decades earlier. Colonel Bamtree, relieved of the shadow that had darkened his later years, became a frequent visitor to Daisy Cottage, sharing with Lady Catherine memories of the young intelligence officer who had been her husband and who had never abandoned his quest for truth, even at the cost of his own life. And in Miss Marple's garden, the foxgloves continued to bloom alongside the roses, their beauty unmarred by their brief association with darkness. For as Miss Marple often observed to her visitors as they admired the stately purple spires, nature, like human nature, contained multitudes of possibility for harm or healing, concealment or revelation, depending entirely on the hands into which it fell.